Dr. Murphy's been working in this area for some time, and I'm sure that she has a lot for us to take away today. So without further ado, Dr. Murphy.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm excited to speak with you about a topic that's really close to me, which is nutrition and prostate cancer. I've left plenty of time at the end to answer questions, and I look forward to hearing your questions and discussing further with you. I will just say, Rochelle, is my screen moving? Because I do still get a message that says my screen sharing is paused.
You're good.
Okay, I will ignore that then. That's good. So Mike gave me a really nice overview of kind of how I ended up where I am today, but I thought I would expand on that a little bit just to kind of provide some perspective to my expertise and then my interest in nutrition and cancer. So I've been working in nutrition cancer for the last 15 years. As Mike said, I completed my PhD in nutrition metabolism at the University of Alberta. I worked out of the Cross Cancer Institute there. If any of you are from the Alberta region, that's a major cancer center for all of Northern Alberta. So my work was focused on diet and lung cancer, and I led a clinical trial to test whether dietary supplement, and specifically fish oil, could reduce muscle and adipose tissue loss in people who had palliative lung cancer. We're also interested in seeing what effect this dietary supplement could have on the tumor's response to chemotherapy. I also completed a fellowship training in oncology at the Cross Cancer Institute. And during this time is when I started to become interested in health more on a population level. So I joined the National Institutes of Health in the US. You can probably see a map of DC behind me here. So it's just outside of DC. I was there for about 3 years. And in 2014, I joined DSM, which is a nutritional supplements company, as a scientist. So later on, I will disparage nutritional supplements a little bit, but that's just to keep in mind that I did work for a nutritional company in the past. So I feel like I have a good a knowledge base there. But in any case, and in 2015, I joined the School of Population Public Health at UBC, as well as I'm affiliated with Cancer Control Research at BC Cancer. And in my current position, I'm studying diet and lifestyle, so things like body weight and physical activity in relationship to cancer prevention and cancer control. I've also been really fortunate to work closely with a group of individuals in urologic science, and particularly the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Program at the Vancouver General Hospital. So some of you who are especially based in BC might be familiar with the program or have used some of their resources before. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that I've done with that program later on. So I will also share, a few years ago, my father-in-law was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and he, like many of you who are tuning in today, had concerns about his diet. What should he be eating, or what should he be avoiding, and how he could potentially use diet to help his recovery. So my goal today is really to provide some insight into the role of nutrition in cancer prevention, as well as during survivorship. And then finally, where can you return to reliable resources? So very briefly, nutrition refers to the larger context, which is ingestion, absorption of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, essential fatty acids, food, energy, and metabolism of foods and drinks. Diet is the sum of foods and beverages that a person consumes. So I sometimes have a bad habit of using these terms interchangeably, but I wanted to just take a quick minute to define that these are in fact separate. So nutrition you can think of as kind of the more broader overall metabolism of foods, as well as ingestion, whereas diet is really specific to kind of eating foods and beverages. So sometimes you might see things that say diet, nutrition, and cancer and wonder, isn't that repetitive, or are those different? My husband at one point finally said to me, he's like, I know we've been together for like 10 years, but I have to ask you, what is the difference between diet and nutrition? Aren't they the same thing? So I just wanted to kind of quickly, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Is that just on my end?
Sorry, just one moment. Let's see if we can fix that. Jane, would you be able to mute your phone?
What's up, GTP?
There we go. Sorry.
That's okay. My dog got all excited by that. So I also wanted to take a minute to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page as to what do we mean when we say that something is a healthy diet. I talk a lot about kind of healthy diets being important for cancer prevention, also for cancer survivorship. Well, what actually is a healthy diet? So what do we mean when we're saying healthy diet? And it's not consistent, and I think that's some of the confusing parts about nutrition. So a healthy diet can mean something very different depending on who you ask. So what I think is a healthy diet is probably very different than what my husband thinks is a healthy diet, or what he might try and convince me is a healthy diet. And you can define it in many different ways. So this is a plate here that shows Eating Well with Canada's food guide. So that's kind of how a lot of the policies and programs in Canada would define a healthy diet. You might have also seen a number of articles or papers that talk about a healthy eating index. And that's a score that people have developed that basically creates a numerical scale based on if you're eating foods that you should be eating versus foods that you should be eating more in moderation. Dietary patterns are also a term that comes up several times. That's more referring to kind of the amounts of foods that are eating in combination. So things like a Mediterranean diet, for example, would be an example of a dietary pattern. And there's also things called diet diversity scores. So those are like, for example, scoring not how many fruits and vegetables you eat, but how many different types of fruits and vegetables you eat. So is it enough to eat all your vegetable servings in carrots, for example, or do you need to also have broccolis, peas, leafy greens, all those type of things? So this is just trying to drive home the idea that a healthy diet differs a lot. It can also be complicated too by different cultures, and also different governments define healthy eating differently. So this is a figure from Japan. This is their food guide. And if you consider the plate version that we have in Canada, you can see how very different it is. So even, for example, they look at fruits on its own, separate from vegetables, and they have a kind of this inverted shape with quite a few grains. This is what they recommend, 5 to 7 a day for adults here. And if you do a very scientific way of defining what healthy eating looks like, which I did with a quick Google search, you get these like beautiful images here. I don't know if anyone truly eats like that, but you might also find something like this as what somebody defines as healthy eating, which is kind of more in line with the ketogenic diets. So healthy eating really encompasses a lot of different things. But if we look very broadly at what nutrition is like in Canada, we can see that overall on a population level, we're not doing very well with respect to meeting our energy requirements, our macronutrient and micronutrient requirements. So about half of women and 70% of men have energy intakes that exceed their needs, meaning that they consume more calories than what they need. 40% of women and 50% of men don't meet fruit and vegetable intakes, and 1 in 4 have fat intakes above the recommended range. You might have also seen a lot about sugary drinks in Canada. In 2015, you can see the average consumption was almost equivalent to a can of soda per day. And really the concerning part is that you see really large amounts of consumption in these youth and young adult groups. So they're consuming about half a liter a day on average. And because this does include on average, so you do have people who never consume sugary drinks. So if you consider that those people are also included in this average, you have quite a big range. So some people are consuming a great deal of sugary drinks. And the reason this is concern is because it's mostly quote unquote kind of empty calories. So it's a lot of calories with very little nutrients that are involved here. So then why is nutrition important? I kind of gave you a bit of a grim picture on where we are with respect to our dietary intake in Canada. 4 in 10 cancers are preventable, and about 8 in 10 cases of stroke, heart disease, and diabetes are preventable. And diet is one of the few ubiquitous modifiable risk factors for chronic diseases. So that is, it's one of the few factors that you can actually change. So this is an infographic that's from the COMPARE study, and I think this really nicely lays out the different risk that can be attributed by these risk factors. So this is a Canada-wide study, and it aimed to estimate the current and future burden of cancer that was due to modifiable lifestyle factors, environmental and infectious agents. So this shows the number of cancers that could be prevented every year in Canada through a number of these factors. So there's a website you can go to too as well, which is preventcancer.ca there at the bottom. And they have a lot of really nice infographics and things that you can kind of toggle through and get more information about each of these. But the ones I wanted to highlight today that are kind of relevant to what we're talking about are the low fruit here, which is 6,700 cases of cancer per year could be prevented if people consumed adequate amounts of fruit. And if we look at vegetables too, there's about 3,500. So we're really quite substantial cases that we're looking at through these risk factors. Some of you might also be familiar with the World Cancer Research Foundation International, or WCRF, and they are also work with the American Cancer Society as well. So they're really the leading authority in diet, nutrition, and physical activity in relationship to cancer. So they collate hundreds of thousands of research studies on these areas, and then they synthesize this evidence to provide kind of overall recommendations to help people prevent cancer. So they have, again, a website that I've listed here, and they have a huge report as well as kind of some interactive matrices and some really user-friendly tools. So if you wanted to dig into some of these recommendations a little bit more with respect to, what are the specific recommendations, I've put kind of the overall ones here, and what the evidence is and the individual studies and all that. It's a really nice user-friendly tool, and it's all free resources as well. So the ones that are particularly pertinent to what we're talking about are the ones around eating whole grains, vegetables, and fruits. You can see limiting fast food, red and processed meat, limiting sugary drinks, and don't rely on dietary supplements. And they really don't provide much in the way of recommendations for after you're diagnosed with a cancer. So this is what they recommend here. It's quite brief, but basically they say after a cancer diagnosis to follow the recommendations for cancer prevention if you can. So those around limiting fast food, limiting red meat consumption, whole grains, and the ones that were just shown on the previous slide. So the reason being that these are fairly broad, I would say, recommendations for this very substantial time period, is that they state that there's really a lack of evidence from randomized controlled trials, and the quality of most studies are really not kind of up to their standards. So they make that kind of broader statement there. So the evidence I was really just mentioning to you refers to diet and the prevention of all cancers. But what about the prevention of prostate cancer specifically? Does diet play a role there? So studies are generally inconsistent with respect to whether diet can help reduce the risk of prostate cancer. So as the WCRF report highlighted, there's really a lack of large, well-designed epidemiologic studies. So those are the studies that are in hundreds to tens of thousands of people. And there's very few of those that are well done and that are specific to prostate cancer. There's also very few randomized controlled trials. That's because randomized controlled trials are incredibly expensive and really not feasible in many cases. So if you think about a randomized controlled trial, you would randomize somebody to a given diet and then expect them to stay on that diet for many, many years, since prostate cancer and many other cancers take a very long time to develop. So it's really not feasible in most cases to expect somebody to follow a diet for 10 plus years and follow them until they develop cancer. So you also need really large sizes as well to accomplish studies like that. So that's just to give you an idea of why you really don't see very many RCTs or randomized control trials. So that said, studies have been generally inconsistent, but there is some suggestion that greater dietary fat, and particularly saturated fat, may increase the risk of prostate cancer. There's also some studies that suggest that carcinogens from cooking meat may also increase the risk. So this is really cooking at high temperatures. So if you think about when you barbecue and there's that really actually delicious kind of black char on meat, those are kind of the carcinogens form when you're cooking out high heat like that. So most of the studies refer to that, which I realize might be a little bit disappointing to some people, but that's what it refers to. And there's also some studies that suggest that high amounts of both dairy and calcium may increase the risk. So there was a large meta-analysis done which analyzed the results from many different studies, and they suggested there was an increased risk. However, a more recent subsequent study found that there was no risk. And there are difficulties in combining studies in these meta-analyses. So the meta-analyses combine a bunch of studies and come up with one overall risk score. But of course, studies are all slightly differently designed. They may assess dietary intake in many different ways. So for example, some studies only considered consumption of milk, whereas others considered milk and cheese, some considered all dairy. So it can be quite difficult to combine them. There's also some studies that suggest that overall healthy dietary patterns may reduce the risk of prostate cancer, as well as other chronic diseases that potentially could increase the risk of prostate cancer. So for things like diabetes, for example. And of course, there is strong evidence that excess body weight increases the risk of prostate cancer, and diet and body weight are very closely linked, of course. And I just wanted to show as well, so this is the WCRF. So as I said, they have a lot of really great tools. You can dig into a lot of the data that they have theirs, and this is theirs that are showing their kind of overall summary of evidence on dietary risk factors for prostate cancer specifically. And they have these risk matrices around decreased risk and increased risk. They grade the evidence as well around convincing and probable. So I won't go into this in detail, but just to kind of show you an example of the kind of resources that are out there if this is something that is of interest to you. So I realized that was a very brief overview of nutrition and cancer prevention, and I'm really happy to answer any questions on that at the end of the talk or elaborate further on any of those points. I've elected to really spend the bulk of the time today on nutrition during survivorship, as I expect that most of the people who are joining today are survivors or who have family or friends who are. So I'll shift a little bit. So this is now thinking about nutrition and survivorship. I've realized I think I was cutting off a little bit of my slides, so I just rearranged that. I hope that has helped a little bit. So in general, men with prostate cancer are recommended to follow Eating Well with Canada's Food Guide. Again, this is an image from the most recent Canada's Food Guide, which was released last year. So the reason being that many of the healthy dietary patterns that promote good health also protect men from progression of prostate cancer and associated chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease. So this is, again, the latest food guide. You may have noticed a big difference from prior years. So there was about 10 years that's passed before this food guide was updated. It used to be the old rainbow model, if anyone has kind of past food guides floating around, but they had a rainbows with different food groups and then different amounts of servings you had to have from each food group. This new food guide has been simplified considerably. So it recommends eating plenty of vegetables and fruits, whole grain foods, and protein foods, choosing proteins that come from plants more often, choosing foods with healthy fats instead of saturated fats. So those are your monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, fats basically that you would find in things like avocado and vegetable oils. Limit highly processed foods, so that would be like your fast foods, for example. And if you do choose these foods, to eat them less often and in small amounts. Prepare your meals and snacks at home whenever possible. Use ingredients that have little added sodium, sugars, or saturated fat. Choose healthier menu options when possible. Making water your drink of choice, and replacing sugary drinks with water. As well, they recommend using food labels to help you and make healthier food choices. So that said, the food guide is not without controversy, and I'm sure many of you have opinions on it as well. So I'm happy to hear that. I by no means think the food guide is perfect. For example, I think the guidance around avoiding saturated fats is not really entirely supported by the evidence, which generally shows no health associations with saturated fat intake. And it's also been criticized as being a very expensive diet that is not necessarily accessible to a large number of Canadians. And it's not very culturally inclusive either. So if you kind of look at this plate, for example, a lot of the foods on there are very fresh. It looks beautiful, but it's not going to be very attainable to many people, either with respect to access to food. So people live in more remote or northern areas, for example, and a lot of these might be a little bit more expensive. So, but that said, I don't mean to completely knock it. I think it is a good starting point and it's a good reference. So if you are really starting off on kind of a journey of wanting to change the way you're eating, it can be a really helpful resource. So in addition to kind of overall diet, there are some specific foods and nutrients that may lower the risk of reoccurrence or increase overall survival. So that's what I'll kind of go through in the next slides. So I'm sure lycopene is something that many of you have come across before, and maybe you weren't familiar with before this. So lycopene is a carotenoid that gives red and pink colors, to foods such as tomatoes, pink grapefruit, and watermelon. Some studies have suggested that lycopene may be beneficial for reducing the risk of prostate cancer, as well as reducing the risk of progression among prostate cancer survivors. So again, that said, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout some of the slides, is that the data are not definitive. So some studies have suggested that increased consumption of tomatoes and tomato-based products may be helpful, but some studies have really shown no effect. That said, there haven't been any studies to my knowledge that have shown an increased risk, especially when you think about the kind of food sources. So there are dietary supplements that provide lycopene, but most of the studies that have found benefits have looked directly at kind of food sources. There's also some evidence that soy-based foods may reduce the risk of prostate cancer and prostate cancer progression. And I've just kind of made a little note to myself here. So when I talk about prostate cancer progression, most of the studies have used PSA as a marker of prostate cancer progression, which we know is imperfect, but that's kind of the best available tool when looking at it in clinical studies like this. But again, similar to lycopene, not all studies have shown a benefit. There's been huge variability in supplements too, so there are many different sources of soy, many different amounts, and some of the reasons that we have such inconclusive results is because studies vary so much in the amount that's given, the source, and what other foods are potentially given with it. So it can be very difficult to prescribe a benefit to one specific part of a diet. And along those lines, flaxseed has also been shown in one study that some flaxseed with a low-fat diet may help to slow progression, again, measured by PSA. This study was, I think, quite exciting to many people because 3 tablespoons of flaxseed is really not a huge amount. It's a little bit difficult. It can be a little bit difficult to incorporate into your diet, but it is quite a small amount versus lycopene. Sometimes it was quite a large amount in food-based sources that was recommended. And flaxseed really has an additional benefit to it of being a good source of omega-3. So there's and fiber as well. So there's a lot of added benefits for flaxseed even beyond cancer progression. There's been several studies that have looked at antioxidants, so things like beta carotene, selenium, and vitamin E. These are all antioxidants that protect our cells in our bodies from damages that can cause cancer. Many studies have looked at diets that are rich in these antioxidants or that have looked at supplementation of these antioxidants. Again, the results have been mixed. One large study did suggest a slight increase in prostate cancer risk with beta carotene supplementation. Again, that was looking at supplementation, though not dietary sources, and subsequent studies did not find the same thing. So if we kind of look at these individually, it's possible, again, that selenium may decrease PSA. Selenium is quite easy to obtain in the diet. So this image here shows you some really good sources of selenium, so Brazil nuts, almonds, mushrooms, as well as some seafood. Again, mixed results through vitamin E and PSA. Vitamin E, again, is very easy to obtain in the diet. It's very rich in things like vegetable oils. And most studies, again, as I think I alluded to earlier, include vitamins and minerals and nutrients in combination with other foods. So it's very difficult to attribute a benefit to one thing. So for example, even if you look in this image here, so this is meant to show that food sources that are rich in selenium, but of course, looking at this, these are not only rich in selenium. A lot of these have vitamin E as well as other phytochemicals, protein, all kinds of different things that are in an individual food. The advice for dietary supplements is to get your nutritional needs from foods and not supplements. There are a lot of additional benefits in foods. So there's fiber, of course, that are not found in supplements, phytochemicals that are not found in supplements. So foods are really the preferred source. And in general, for supplements, it's best to avoid doses that are greater than your recommended daily allowance, which is your RDA. In particular, vitamin E supplementation, it's possible that it may reduce the risk of prostate cancer progression, but vitamin E supplements of about 400 IUs or greater have been associated with adverse effects. And the concern really around dietary supplements is that they're not highly regulated, and the amount that is in dietary supplements can vary quite a bit, even from what it says on the label, and it can be very easy to exceed your needs with a dietary supplement because you also need to consider what you might be taking in food form. So there's quite a bit of caution around that. However, that said, the exception to the rule is really around vitamin D supplements. So it can be very difficult, especially living in Canada, which I think I had a brief look at where most of the locations are that you were joining from, and it seemed like most of you are from Canada, and especially today it's sunny in Vancouver, but normally it's quite dark here. So the exception to the rule is really around vitamin D supplements. And of course, as prostate cancer survivors, bone health is incredibly important. Men with prostate cancer need adequate vitamin D to maintain your bone health, particularly if you're treated with hormone therapy. And vitamin D helps with calcium absorption, and both calcium and vitamin D are needed for bone building. So the RDA for vitamin D is about 600 IUs for men, and 800 IUs if you're over 70 years. And so a vitamin D supplement might be needed. So somewhere in the range of 400 to 1,000 IUs per day is likely needed. And supplement levels up to about 4,000 IUs per day vitamin D levels up to about 4,000 IUs per day from both supplements and food forms are generally considered to be safe. At this time, however, the use of vitamin D supplements with the idea to prevent prostate cancer or to lower the risk of prostate cancer prevention is not recommended. So the use of vitamin D is really surrounding bone health. And in recent years, there's really been a shift towards considering the whole diet rather than individual nutrients and foods. So although I just spent the last several minutes talking about these kind of individual foods and vitamins and minerals, we're really kind of moving away from this reductionist approach to more of a holistic approach. The reason being that foods and nutrients are not eaten in isolation. They're complex, they interact with each other, and they're not dependent. So for example, it's not as easy as saying you should limit saturated fats, because there's always going to be fats in foods. There's always going to be fats in the way we cook. So we have to consider, if we ask somebody to avoid saturated fats, they're going to substitute it with something else. And we need to consider that the substitution needs to be as healthy as possible. So I also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge the importance of physical activity and body weight as part of an overall healthy lifestyle. So today's talk is really focused on nutrition, but of course, nutrition is just part of the picture. So next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing with the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Group in BC. So as you know, prostate cancer is unique from many other cancers, such as lung cancer, colorectal cancer, where the role of nutrition is really to manage malnutrition and weight loss. So generally, registered dietitians or RDs in clinical settings are dedicated to supporting those who are experiencing malnourishment, meaning that most prostate cancer survivors don't have access to RDs within the public healthcare system. However, as I've just discussed, we know that nutrition is really important for men with prostate cancer, but we know much less about how we can better support the needs of men with prostate cancer, and in particular, within a public healthcare setting, meaning that we're not asking men to meet their needs, their nutritional needs, by paying out of pocket, for example. So the work that I want to talk to you briefly about was led by Masters of Public Health student Caitlin McLaughlin, as well as members of the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Program, which is based out of the Vancouver General Hospital. I've included a link here to the paper as well. I realize it's not necessarily, research studies are not necessarily the most user-friendly to read, but it is freely available. So if you're interested in reading about it, yeah, you're welcome to, or ask me additional questions at the end. So the goal of our study here was to understand how to support men with prostate cancer. To do that, we conducted a needs assessment of nutritional services to understand what the current state was in Canada. We used 4 viewpoints for this. We looked at a patient perspective using an evaluation of a nutrition education sessions that are offered at the Vancouver General Hospital. We also did a survey of health professionals who provide health services related to urologic care in BC, as well as a review of current nutritional services that are offered throughout Canada, and then a literature review as well to look at best practices for supporting nutritional needs of men with prostate cancer. So to provide the patient perspective on nutritional service, we analyzed patient feedback on the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Program, and they provide a nutritional education session, which is 2 hours. It's in person, it's delivered by a registered dietitian from BC Cancer. It's a lecture style format. Topics include things like nutrition and exercise guidelines, plant-based foods, dietary patterns, obtaining nutrients from foods, but not supplements. So it's kind of a bit of an expanded version of what I just talked about. So after the session is over, attendees are asked to complete a voluntary evaluation, and they are anonymous. So we collected 207 forms from 14 different sessions, included 130 men with prostate cancer and their partners who can attend the sessions as well. So this slide provides an overview of what we found from the patient evaluations. Overall, we were really happy to see that everybody reported that the education sessions were really easy to understand. Everyone was overall pleased with it. They felt like the 2 hours was a good amount of time, which I thought was going to be too long, but it's great to see that people are so interested in nutrition. Most of them found that it was very beneficial. Some people did indicate they wanted more information on specific dietary components of things like sugar, GMO, animal proteins, dietary supplements. As well, some people wanted more information on practical tips, further nutritional services. So this is really a one-off. So it's offered one time, this nutrition education session, and there's no subsequent support really available. Although recently they've been introducing some dietary counseling, which is, again, something that a few of the individuals had indicated wanting. So overall, people were pleased with it, but there was some room for developing additional support for these patients. We also developed a survey to seek perspectives on the need for nutritional services from healthcare professionals in BC. So the survey asked 6 questions about the importance of nutritional services, the content of services, and how they should be delivered. So we identified 56 individuals who we asked to complete the survey, or the survey. So of the 56, 38 responded, which we thought was actually quite good. The majority of health professionals reported that men had told them that they had nutrition-related concerns. About 60% agreed that men with prostate cancer needed more nutritional support. However, we did have about 16% said that they felt the current nutritional services were sufficient, and the remaining 24% responded that they were unaware of nutritional services for men with prostate cancers. Others believed that there was not a high demand for nutrition information among men, that there were already sufficient services, or that men were just unaware of programs, or that nutritional support was not as critical for men with prostate cancer compared to other cancers. So with respect to content, most individuals felt that it should be focused on weight management, and then another 54% thought that it should be on reducing the risk of prostate cancer progression. So I will just kind of briefly say too that the reason these percentages don't add up to 100 is because people were able to select more than one response. So in case you're thinking, wow, your math is really terrible, that's why you see that 61 and 54%, for example. So the majority of people also responded that nutritional services should be available to men at multiple times after diagnosis. People felt that consecutive group education sessions or online resources, as well as individual nutritional counseling with a registered dietitian, would be helpful. There were quite a few barriers though identified. They were around the need for more nutritional services. However, they needed capacity to do this, that there was a lack of funds available, and a lack of registered dietitians who could help meet these needs. We also did an environmental scan. So we looked at 30 organizations that provided nutritional services across Canada. 22 people responded when we asked for more information on these services. Of these 22, however, only 6 provided services that were specific for men with prostate cancer. The others were all around kind of overall cancer or a mix of cancer types. So for example, prostate cancer and breast cancer. So of these 6 services, 4 had a group, did group education, 3 used online services, and there was really kind of a range of what was delivered. So some had cooking classes, some did group education, and some did wellness retreat and individual counseling. So and I'll talk about some of these resources later on because I think they might be potentially of interest to you. So what did we learn from this needs assessment? So as evident from the environmental scan, there were really limited nutritional services that were specifically targeted for men with prostate cancer. And this is despite the high prevalence of prostate cancer in Canada and the effectiveness of nutritional services. So it's perhaps unsurprising that men with prostate cancer, as well as prostate cancer healthcare professionals, did identify a need for more nutritional services, although not everybody did identify that there is a need. We felt that nutrition services should consider flexibility in delivery of format, support at multiple times throughout survivorship, as well as embedding nutrition as part of overall supportive care. However, of course, this is a challenge within a public healthcare system where nutrition services, again, are predominantly prioritized to those who are malnourished. So new models of care with supplemental funding may help to close this gap. So for example, the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Program in BC is funded primarily through supplemental funds from the Ministry of Health. So in the next section, I wanted to discuss some reliable resources. So one of the biggest challenges out there is that all the information, how do you know what's real, who to trust, and what to do? I think sometimes it feels like even scientists can't really get it right. Something you might read on a given day seems to contradict something you read just a few weeks ago. There's also a huge number of quote unquote bogus for-profit journals. So unfortunately, even if findings have been published, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've been published somewhere reliable. And that can be really hard, even for people like myself who do this for a living, to sometimes sift through what is kind of a good study and what's not. And there was a study that I thought was really interesting. It was out of Dalhousie, and they reported that the top sources that people turn to for healthy eating advice. And you can see why there's a lot of misinformation, because most people turn to friends and family. They kind of turn to general research, social media, cookbooks and magazines, TV, and Canada's Food Guide was kind of way down there in the list. So I wanted to kind of briefly put this out here. I thought it might be helpful, but when you're reading something, there's some kind of general flags to watch out for, recommendations that promise a quick fix, studies that might vilify a single food or ingredient. So such as sugar, it gets demonized a lot because it's predominantly found in foods that have very little other nutritional value. Claims that sound too good to be true, recommendations that come from one study. So I like to say that you should consider study in kind of the overall tapestry. So if you consider it to be like one quilt square in an overall patchwork quilt, so don't look just at a single square, look at kind of the overall picture and what that tells you and what the overall body of evidence tells you. As well, kind of labeling things as good versus bad. I don't really believe in things that are bad. I'm more of the school of moderation approach. And recommendations without evidence, so recommendations that don't cite a study, for example. So now that I've gone over some of the flags for resources, which you shouldn't trust, I did want to highlight a few resources that are, I think, very helpful. The first, I'm tooting my own horn a little bit here, but this is a series of videos that I produced along with colleagues at the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care Program. So we were fortunate to receive a grant from the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. It provided funds for us to develop 3 short videos on nutrition evidence, on evidence-based nutrition. So they're about 8-minute videos. They're designed to be really interactive and fun. There are things on like myth busting. So what are the benefits of organic foods, for example, as well as really applied tips like grocery shopping and cooking and tracking your dietary intake. And these videos are really close to my heart because we were really fortunate to have Dale, who is a prostate cancer survivor, his wife and his daughter who starred in the videos. They provided content, input on the content of the videos as well. And the videos were actually even filmed in my house. So you can probably see the yellow chairs right here are where I'm sitting right now talking to you. So they're available on the Prostate Cancer Supportive Care YouTube channel, so you can access them at any time and kind of return to them if you want to refresh your memory on something. There's also some general resources on healthy diets. So Dietitians of Canada can help you find a dietitian in your area. As I mentioned, Canada's Food Guide. There's also Provincial Dial a Dietitian. So in BC, we have the 811 or Health Link, and they do have dietitians who have expertise specifically in oncology as well. And those are all free resources, I should say. And then, of course, there are also prostate cancer specific resources. A number of these you might be familiar with. And of course, I have to mention the Prostate Cancer Foundations. I didn't want to get in trouble if I omitted that one. And then I'm based at the BC Cancer Agency. So BC Cancer Agency also has a nutrition guide for men with prostate cancer. It was last updated in 2014, but it is a very comprehensive guide to diet. It's a very large document, but it is written in a very accessible way. And then I also wanted to point out one of the resources that we came across in our needs assessment, and some of you might be familiar with this. I think I see a few of you are from Ontario. This is a program that's run out of the Toronto General Hospital and Princess Margaret. So they have an in-person cooking class, which during non-COVID times, but they also have cooking videos and recipes online. And they have a large number of options to choose from. And I think this can be a really useful starting place, especially if you're looking for ideas about how to make dietary changes and how to make these changes kind of exciting. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm happy to answer any questions during this. And if you have any questions afterwards, please also feel free to reach out to me. This is the best email address for me. And then I've also put the links to my websites as well if you want to contact me at any time.